I'd like to begin tonight with the following land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Good evening. Hi, how are you? Thank you for joining us for the second of a two-part series on the outcomes of the 2022 midterm elections with our very talented Professor of Political Science, Jake Grumbach. I'm Yvette Moy. I know, you can give an applause. That's okay. We love him. That's okay. Show some love. That's right. I'm Yvette Moy, and I am the University of Washington's Director of Public Lectures, and our offices are housed in the Graduate School. Before we begin tonight's talk, I have a few housekeeping items to run through really quickly. If you haven't done so already, if you wouldn't mind taking your cell phones out and silencing them, please. We ask that you please refrain from video or audio recording this evening's lecture, as well as taking no photos, please. There will be a recording of this lecture about 24 to 48 hours following this talk that you can find on the Office of Public Lectures YouTube channel. Also, if you have a question for our speaker and you're feeling a little shy, you can email them in to mayiask@uw.edu. We also have conventional ways of asking questions with the podium, the microphones in each aisle. Tonight, I understand we have some family members of Jake's here, of Dr. Grumbach's here. So I want to welcome you all for coming and thanking you for showing support to our very beloved faculty member. And then Dr. Grumbach will be introduced by the University of Washington's professor in the Department of Political Science, Dr. Megan Ming Francis.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Oh, I love this. Okay. All right. So thank you so much for that introduction. As Yvette said, I'm Dr. Megan Ming Francis, and tonight it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Jacob Grumbach. Today, I'm going to give you, though, two introductions. You're in for a treat. First, the formal one. So Professor Grumbach is an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington and a faculty associate with the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies. He is also the director of WISER, the Washington Institute for the Study of Inequality and Race. His research focuses on the political economy of U.S. democracy with an emphasis on public policy, racial and economic inequality, American federalism, and statistical methods. His very successful book, I brought this up here because I like props, Laboratories of Democracy, was published in July of 2022. His research has appeared in the top journals in the fields of political science, labor, and economics. Previously, Dr. Grumbach was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton University, and he received his PhD from UC Berkeley in 2018. All right, now that we did formalities, now for the second introduction. I first met Professor Grumbach as Jake, a scruffy, eager graduate student at a conference in Oxford. He was the youngest scholar at that conference, and many of us were wondering what he was doing there. I have been following his career ever since because he did very well. I saw him a few years later at our national conference, the American Political Science Association, big conference. And at that time, he was about to hit the job market, and he was asking if UW had any jobs. We didn't at the time. He was always chill. Our conversations ranged from big political topics to the latest in hip-hop music. Jake is an old head and a new head as well when it comes to music. Anyways, fast forward a number of years, things change, right? And he got a job in my department, got tenure, and has a book that everyone is talking about. He is a rising star, and I am so pleased to be able to learn from him today, along with the rest of you. Please join me in welcoming Professor Grumbach to the stage.
Thanks, Megan. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Yvette Moy, for always putting on an incredibly efficient and sort of well-organized event. It makes it so nice to do. And Professor Francis, that's the best intro of all time. And I really think it's actually really true. I really did. All of those things are true. I also saw Professor Francis give a talk when I was a PhD student at UC Berkeley at a seminar, and I was sort of the grad student employee, and I had this, it's not like the best job, but I, got to sometimes attend, if I got lucky, I got to attend the dinner for the visiting speaker, and I got to go to the dinner, and it was like the greatest thing. And from then, I really followed Professor Francis's work really closely from then on, and would go, like, at these conferences she's talking about, I would kind of follow her around and go to all her talks. And then, fast forward, I was lucky enough to get a job in this department that I'm so thankful for after. It's not easy to get these academic jobs, and I couldn't have ended up at a better place. I'm super thrilled to be here. So thanks so much for taking the time on like another gorgeous winter evening to be here. Really appreciate that. That's not the best timing, not the easiest. So I extra appreciate it. And if you came for the first lecture, you also might have been like slightly depressed after. It was about many of the threats facing American democracy, which we still, for the most part, face. But I think in this talk, I'm really going to be talking, for the most part, about what we can do in the longer term to get American democracy at all levels, but with my research, a special focus on the state level of American politics, how to get it sort of on the right track in terms of democracy so that people really, regardless of your policy views or political party and things like that, you have a fair chance of having your voice heard in the institutions of American government. But the first thing I think you guys wanted to do is a little bit of horse race coverage like last time, like we're on cable news. So here we see the results for Congress in the November midterms. And we saw that the Republicans took control of the U.S. House by what looks like about 2 seats. This is slightly before the final tally. And then the Senate is going to remain tied, but with Democrats in the White House, they'll have the tie-breaking vote. So Democratic control of the Senate, Republican control of the House. That means with a Democratic president no longer having unified control of the government, national policy making will slow down. And the other big takeaways from, if I were a pundit out there on one of those, Sunday morning shows, Meet the Press, and I was giving you my hot takes on politics, I would say, if you're following the horse race, the predictions by pundits and analysts were really that the Republicans were going to sweep in a red wave for the most part. That didn't pan out. They still did take the U.S. House, but Democrats certainly overperformed expectations of fundamentals, things that take into account the state of the economy, the approval rating of the president in the White House. Given those facts on the ground, the Democrats really outperformed expectations, and they were helped by both persuasion of Republican voters and swing voters, right? Getting people to cross the aisle to vote for the other party or somebody who doesn't identify with either party. But they also turned out the base, including young voters. So this was a year of, for a midterm election with a Democratic president, usually the base of that party stays home and the out party really gets worked up and ready to, fight against that president by kicking his party out of Congress. Been a him, I get to say, because still been all male presidents. But what happened here is that for the most part, youth turnout, that is turnout of people under 35, was still at 27%, which sounds super low, but that is the best midterm with a Democratic president in 2 generations for young voters. It's that the baseline is just so low. So that's a sort of success story, right? That almost was the level of youth turnout in 2018, which was the sort of resistance, sort of anti-Trump midterm election that would be expected to turn out more young voters, right? In black voters, college-educated women in both cities and suburbs, right, also turned out. So this is my piece of non-punditry. Usually pundits have one key narrative. This group won the election. But the reality is much more nuanced. It took persuasion of swing voters as well as turning out the base. And then also in terms of, pundits love talking about messaging. Which messages are going to, really get the soccer moms and the NASCAR dads and so forth this election. And the big messaging, if you turned on news, especially outside of King County, if you traveled to another state, I gave a talk at the Arizona State University Law School, in a real swing state. And there was 24/7, I'm trying to watch my NFL game, and it was 24/7 commercials of, crime. You are absolutely, if you walk out on the sidewalk, you might die. There's a good chance you will die. Pronouns, woke overreach in culture. This was a real constant, and those messages, like in a behavioral sense, did not prove as effective as expected again. So that's my horse race punditry. But as I mentioned last time, to actually understand what's going on in American politics and potentially how to change it, we have to look past this sort of sports team version, like we're following our favorite sports team in the horse race, right? We have to think about policy and institutions. So public policies, law, and institutions, institutional rules and procedure, they shape what we are able to do in politics. They incentivize or disincentivize certain actions, and is much more consequential to our political world and our lives and who is in power and out of power than sort of the campaign season of which message is going to be most persuasive on the airwaves, all right? And we're still in a crisis of American democracy. The crisis was, I would say, the acute sort of parts of the crisis were certainly pushed back a few years, but many of the crises that I had talked about, crises related to state-level policymaking in terms of gerrymandering legislative districts, advantaging one party's voters over the other, suppressing the vote, making it more difficult for some groups to vote, and probably most acutely in a presidential election, the idea of what's called electoral subversion, the idea that a county or state-level election administrator could go rogue and attempt to give the electoral college votes of that state to whichever presidential candidate they may choose. And we saw on January 6th, 2021, how that is when those electoral college votes are certified, and there are many weak points in that system that need to be strengthened. So in thinking about this, we talked last time about how American federalism in the U.S. Constitution, that's a really important factor in the U.S. Constitution that makes the U.S. unique compared to other countries around the world. But the U.S. gives a huge amount of constitutional authority and leeway to the state level, the lower level, right? And that's true in terms of economic and sort of social policy making, right? We talked about how the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs made it legal for state governments to fully ban abortion, right, by overturning Roe v. Wade. That's giving more authority or leeway for states to really determine what people's lives are like, right? And we've seen divergence over the past generation between states, mostly between red and blue states, in terms of public policy on economics, the minimum wage or tax rates on the wealthy. We've seen it in social policy like abortion rates or recreational marijuana. But we've seen huge divergence in democratic institutions that are also really importantly run at the state level in the U.S., unlike other countries around the world. The U.S. states are determine who is allowed to vote, how easy it is for them to vote and the procedures around their vote, how much their vote counts given the legislative district map, and how to certify those votes to determine the winner, right? That's unique compared to even other federal systems around the world. And that's where the threats have really been arising, and that's what I cover in much of my recent research. But what we're covering tonight is that, in part, 2022 was a decent year for American democracy, but that there are long-term threats that still remain, that I just mentioned, and they require more long-term remedies than cycle-by-cycle November electioneering and campaigning, right? They require long-term strategies of building organizations, changing institutions and policies to insulate American democracy from threat, right? We're going to talk about specifically today a couple key potential remedies and related remedies, but one is in terms of what types of policies and policy designs can people advocate for at the national level and sometimes at the state level to protect American democracy. Versions were similar in the mid-20th century when national policymaking, for example, in the Voting Rights Act, enfranchised Black Americans in the South for the first time, right? That is a national policy that affected state-level Jim Crow voting laws. Similarly, now we can talk about which national policies would affect state-level, for example, gerrymandering or voter suppression or the threat of electoral subversion. But then second, and also sort of deeply based in sort of line of my research in this part with a co-author, Paul Freimer, that actually we don't talk about it enough, but the labor movement in the US and the decline of the labor movement has been really integral to the threats to democracy that we see today. And that's not something we often think about, the relationship between labor organization and democracy, but I'll talk about that as a potential way to sort of shift the trend in American democracy. All right, so democracy in the 2022 midterms. So we saw some good news. Many of the explicitly stop the steal myth candidates that essentially said, you know, if I lose the election, I may not actually accept that loss, or I don't believe the results of the 2020 presidential election, and I'm promoting conspiracies around mass voter fraud or mass fraud in the use of mail ballots in mail ballot states and so forth. And they do not pledge to actually adhere to the sort of what should be universally held rules of if you get the most votes according to existing institutional rules, you get to win the election, and if not, you lose the election and you peacefully cede power to your opponent, right? That's not a guarantee in American politics anymore. And one piece of good news is that many of those stop the steal candidates, for example, in Arizona, quite prominently, lost their general elections. Similarly, there was reform of what's called the Electoral Count Act. That was the 19th century law that established the sort of modern version of the Electoral College certification that we saw on January 6, 2021. Not the insurrection part, but the certification of Electoral College votes. And that has huge ambiguities in that oldie-timey law. Huge ambiguities about which members of the federal government can launch an objection to electoral college votes and what states and county administrators can do in presidential elections, right? But Congress did, in an omnibus bill with many other economic and other provisions in that law, did reform this and protected sort of presidential elections in some ways from electoral subversion. Specifically in this reform, they required a higher standard, a higher number of senators and members of the U.S. House to object to an electoral college certification to get into sort of a disputed election, right? So that increased the protection a little bit, but there's huge protections that need to be strengthened as well. But the bad news of the 2022 midterms, is that many of those same stop the steal candidates, while they lost their general elections, right? They won their primaries in smashing fashion, often with super majorities of the Republican base vote. And what primary elections can do is really shift what parties stand for overall. The candidates that win primary elections sort of set the agenda for your party, and many of these candidates did push the Republican Party agenda further down the road of sort of electoral, sort of anti-democratic positions when it comes to free and fair elections. In addition, in the states, the North Carolina Supreme Court, right, the state-level Supreme Court of North Carolina, ushered in a sort of stop-the-steal conservative majority of justices that appear to support, as a court, they appear to want to allow extreme gerrymandering in North Carolina, which we saw in the 2010s, but they appear again willing to do that in the coming years. So in part, some bad news when it comes to American democracy. But these are the sort of narrow issues. There's even badder news than that. Partisan gerrymandering remains legal, as I mentioned. Voter suppression remains legal. there's still this open path to electoral subversion. And in general, despite those fear-based messaging around crime, racial panic, and sort of transgender panic and so forth did not fully pan out, much of mass politics is still driven by these social conflicts that are actually highly destabilizing to a democratic political system. All right? How do we respond to those democratic threats? Well, again, if I was, James Carville there on a Sunday show, I'd say, listen, you just got to win elections. Like, if you're a pro-democracy group or candidate, just win your election. Beat the anti-democracy people, and do that by running better candidates, right? Candidates who appeal to voters better, right? Be viewed as moderate, not extreme on either side. Don't be viewed as too left or too right. Be viewed as moderate, right? And it's like, okay, run good candidates, have people view you as like reasonable, like that's great, thank you very much, like really appreciate it. Like, didn't know that, run good candidates, I hadn't thought of that one, right? But this is literally what you hear as punditry, So I could have made a lot more money in a different field. But again, to understand American politics, we have to look beyond the horse race, even though I'm kind of addicted to the horse race. I'm addicted to my smartphone. You may be too, right? We love it. It's like following our sports team. But we have to look to policy and institutions and take our vegetables to understand American democracy. All right, so the first potential solution to the long-term set of threats to American democracy that I've discussed. So first is national policy making around voting rights, districting, and protecting electoral certification in presidential elections, okay? And like throughout history, when state governments took steps to threaten American democracy, so again, state governments were those that had laws around slavery, right? That was a set of state-level laws, right? Then once the Civil War was fought and the national government came in and dismantled the Confederacy and for a brief time created what was called Reconstruction in the South and occupied the South and established black voting rights for a short period of time, about 12 years in the 1860s and 70s, right? Very famously, you see pictures of Northern Union soldiers protecting newly free black voters walking through Louisiana swamps to polling places and things like that. Is a powerful moment of national enforcement of democracy, right? Then again, states come in and the Supreme Court, national government pulls back Reconstruction. The Supreme Court, through Plessy v. Ferguson, says Jim Crow laws. States can actually do that. That's totally constitutional if a state wishes to. And all those former Confederate states established new restrictions that disenfranchised black Americans, right? This was a state-level threat to democracy that wasn't stopped or, for the most part stopped. Mass enfranchisement of black Americans in the South happened through national enforcement of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, right? So this pattern of state-level threats to democracy and national enforcement of democracy standards, right, is a pattern throughout history that, an advocate for democracy may want to hope for going forward, right? So again, states are especially threatening to democracy beyond the fact that they have sort of, hold the levers over the rules of democracy, because if anti-democracy groups capture state governments, then they can establish a beachhead by which they can expand anti-democracy outcomes more broadly throughout the American political system, right? So Jim Crow was not confined. The political ramifications of Jim Crow and mass disenfranchisement of black Americans didn't confine itself to the South. It affected who was in Congress and the Senate and what national policies happened, right? Similarly now, gerrymandering in Wisconsin or North Carolina matters for the U.S. as a whole, right? This is happening again with Supreme Court cases in the 2010s that expanded state-based leeway to restrict voting rights and gerrymander districts in a partisan fashion, right? So I would propose, as others, my co-author Charlotte Hill on some of my statistical work on voter registration policies, as well as her co-authors like Lee Drutman, have put forward new proposals for something like a federal elections agency. So this would be a new agency that would establish standards, and Congress would pass standards nationally that all states must adhere to, so that, for example, if you are going to restrict access to mail balloting, for example, it may have to be reviewed by this agency, or this agency would automatically register all voters to vote. So voters couldn't be purged systematically in different ways from state-based voting rolls and so forth, right? Furthermore, and potentially even more importantly, a federal elections agency policy in Congress could ban gerrymandering in the states, right? So what currently is happening in the 2020 gerrymandering cycle, it's actually pretty funny. The 2010s were heavily gerrymandered in favor of Republicans overall, and there was basically no pro-democratic gerrymandered state. This election cycle, it looked like New York and Nevada were going to give very favorable maps to Democrats, gerrymandered in favor of Democrats. Nevada stayed gerrymandered in favor of Democrats, not quite as extreme as the 2010s in Wisconsin and North Carolina, but it stayed a Democratic gerrymander. But actually, the Democratic Supreme Court of New York threw out the Democratic gerrymander and put in a pro-Republican map, and actually, in part, handed the U.S. House to the Republican Party, right? The parties are actually quite different in their use of gerrymandering in this way. But the irony is, the one time the Republican parties in Congress got interested in a national gerrymandering ban was after Democrats started gerrymandering for that brief point, right? So that's, in game theory, we call that the prisoner's dilemma, right? Or a extensive form prisoner's dilemma. But the point there is it's really hard to uphold norms. Don't gerrymander, don't take an advantage for your own party if the other party keeps saying like, oh, you go low, we'll go high. We're not gonna stoop down to that level, right? Actually, ironically, things tend to get fairer for both parties when both parties start to cheat and say, we'll both be better off if neither of us cheat. Does that make sense? Cool. And lastly, further reforming the Electoral Count Act through other important chains of command at the state level, so that no single state or county administrator can essentially throw out the popular vote in their state to give electoral college votes to whichever candidate they may wish in a presidential election. Another democracy reform that's crucial comes out of one of my grad students, and I'm super psyched about this. This is a figure from Rachel Funk Fordham's new paper, Wealth, Power, and Anti-Democratic Influence, the Effect of Citizens United on State Democratic Performance. And if you remember, if you're around my age, you know, and you're in the sort of the 2000s and 2010s, coming of age politically, you were really interested in campaign finance. Money in politics was a huge issue being discussed, right? But it's since sort of fallen out of fashion, as even political scientists say, you know, a lot of democracy advocates really overstate the role of money in politics, and it's actually not that big a deal. Money in politics, it's really hard with all the money in politics for any given corporation or wealthy person to really influence what's going on. But Rachel Fordham comes in a school of new, quantitative, sophisticated research, and her research really shows that Citizens United, as a Supreme Court ruling, had a dramatic effect on state-level democracy, and I'll tell you how. So Citizens United, what it did, the ruling in 2011 from the Supreme Court, it threw out all state-based restrictions on money in politics, right? It said, states, you cannot restrict independent expenditures or large sums of money that are not donated directly to a candidate, but generally in support of candidates or parties or issues, or against candidates or parties or issues, right? They're just not legally allowed to coordinate with the specific candidate's campaign. In practice, that always happens. But here, Rachel Fordham showed that states that previously had these campaign finance restrictions that were removed by Citizens United, they're in that dark blue line there. They started as having pretty strong state-level democracy scores using the democracy index that I introduced in the last talk, essentially like how free, fair, equitable is a state's voting rights and procedures and its legislative districting through gerrymandering, right? But then after Citizens United, the dotted line there, the dotted vertical line, those states whose campaign finance restrictions were removed reduced their sort of quality of their democracy really radically. And Rachel puts forward a great sort of argument. This paper is now available online. I'll try to get it up on some page related to this talk. Really impressed with this paper, but it's very clear that removing restrictions on campaign finance, allowing sort of bigger voice through money in politics has reduced the quality of democracy, and we can understand that logically. If you have a huge amount of money and you don't want the masses through democracy to, take away that money or power, right? You're probably not going to be all that supportive of democracy, right? So there's a long-term theory there that the super wealthy, they like some democracy, but they don't want to give the people too much power. And in this case, we can clearly see through the removal of Citizens United or campaign finance restrictions in the states that allowing this new torrent of money has reduced the quality of democracy in those states. So campaign finance reform could look like, so one thing that's a challenge with the Supreme Court ruling in Citizens United that says money is speech, right? So corporations and individuals' First Amendment rights would be violated if you restrict that speech. That puts campaign finance reformers in a legal bind a bit, so you can't really reduce the money in the system, right? You can't really restrict donations via this legal doctrine. But what you can do is kind of amplify the voice of ordinary people to make it as loud as the big money sound, okay? That's what you can do legally. So solutions like that in campaign finance are things like a democracy voucher program. And has anybody heard of a democracy voucher program? Good, because Seattle has one. It's a really important local reform in Seattle where you get a credit, as you all raise your hands, you guys know this, you get a credit that you can donate to a local politician, and that politician, by taking those democracy voucher dollars, commits to not taking other big private money, okay? This helps even in the Supreme Court's Citizens United era. This is a way to, again, amplify the voice of ordinary people and reduce the relative voice of big money, right? And this could be expanded beyond Seattle, of course, and use your democracy vouchers. So I've done a little bit of research on this quantitatively. Not enough use it. It diversifies money in politics in many ways, but is not used by everyone. Many people leave those democracy vouchers, and who do you think leaves them the most? Young people. Don't turn them in. We got to do better. Or I'm not that young anymore. You young people got to do better. Another would be a small donor matching program. If you're a small donor, you donate under $50 or something like that, that could be matched with public funds. So there are some local programs to match small dollar donations, but this could be done at any level. Those two kinds of reforms could, again, balance the sort of voice of money in politics that has threatened democracy in the 2010s. But this second solution, and the one I'm going to talk about more in depth, is about reviving the labor movement. So we know that labor unions, right? Labor unions engage in collective bargaining, so rather than an individual employee bargaining with their employer over their contract and their wages and their health benefits and so forth, what labor unions do is collectively bargain, and we know from this figure here, the red line is union membership in the U.S. So in the 1930s, labor unions, under Congress and Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, established the National Labor Relations Act and sort of formalized labor unions. In the mid-20th century, you see huge growth in union membership where nearly 40% of American workers were unionized at its peak. And then you see a gradual downward slope of union membership and a dramatically downward slope after 1980. And also in this figure, you see economic inequality in the U.S. with a sort of coarse measure in blue, the share of income going to the top 10%, but you can cut this top 1% and so forth. But there you see the descriptive relationship that has been established by economists over and over in a causal sense, right, is that labor unions really reduced economic inequality in the U.S. and produced a robust middle class in the mid-20th century. And beyond that, there's new important research that actually labor unions dramatically reduced racial inequality in wages, right, through especially the rise of public sector employment and black workers in, for example, the postal service and municipal employment, and access to labor union jobs in the public sector grew a black middle class in northern cities especially, that then reduced economic inequality between racial groups in the US, as well as gender. There's new amazing research by an economist, Barbara Biasi, where she actually looks at restrictions on labor unions in the states. When states pass a law restricting labor unions, what happens is that men and women, the gender pay gap starts widening after labor unions are restricted. And that's because collective bargaining, right, reduces the potential for gender bias in sort of negotiations over contracts, right? So after Wisconsin restrict public sector labor unions in the 2010s under Scott Walker, you see a massive gender gap in, for example, teacher pay in Wisconsin that you don't see in states like Washington State. So we know economic inequality overall and by racial group and by gender group reduced with the labor movement in the 20th century and to some extent the 21st century. But beyond that, so those are kind of established findings, right, in economics and political economy. But the real question that I and a co-author, Paul Freimer, and others are asking these days is the labor movement related to American democracy? Not just economic outcomes, but how about the stability of a democratic political system, small d democratic, or, you know, democratic republic or whatnot, right? Can the stability of a free and fair political system be enhanced through organized labor? That's the question. And, you know, the answer is not so clear, right? If we look to history, there's actually many times where the U.S. labor movement has been anti-democratic and often explicitly racist, right? So here's a American Federation of Labor and Knights of Labor in the late 19th century poster in favor of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was an explicitly racist immigration bill that essentially had in its text and in the advocacy of that text the explicit inferiority of non-European racial groups and bans on those non-European racial groups from immigrating to the U.S. And that lasted until 1965, and U.S. early labor unions, like the Knights of Labor, they were explicitly nativist, xenophobic, and racist, and did not believe in the democratic rights of those groups that didn't share, in this case, their racial or national origin identities, okay? There, what I just said. In addition, we know in the 20th century, as racial conflict is happening during the civil rights movement especially, that firms or corporations, when mostly white labor unions were gaining strength or going on strike, they would bring in black strike-breaking workers to foment racial conflict, and the white labor unions often would go along with this fomented conflict and turn their aggression and sights on the black strike-breaking workers, right? That was and this book is a fascinating sort of barely produced book, but I love this page. So this page actually has my grandfather, my mom's dad, Louis Martin, was the editor of the Chicago Defender, a black newspaper in Chicago, and before that he started what was called the Michigan Chronicle, a black newspaper in Detroit in the mid-20th century, and he was very interested in, he thought integrating labor unions racially was an important way to build the black middle class. And here he is discussing the use in auto plants of black strike-breaking workers by the corporations, by the auto companies, and how white unions often went along with antagonizing, rather than going after the corporate bosses fomenting this conflict, going after the black strike-breaking workers, and how that sort of lack of solidarity and racial conflict had to end if we were going to build a robust interracial middle class in the U.S. So I love finding little things like that. Also, shout out to all the journalists out there. It's really cool. Like, it does do important work, I think. But then there's a change in some unions beginning in the 1930s, in the Great Depression and the New Deal period. And this part of history suggests a more hopeful potential theory in favor of support for democracy from the labor movement in the U.S. In the 1930s, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, was it was the biggest union in the U.S. It quickly became the biggest union in the 1930s. And they promoted literature like this, where they were the first, after sort of sociologists like W.E.B. Du Bois, potentially the original American sociologist and others, to make the argument that essentially the ruling class divides the working class with racism, right? That became an explicit piece of messaging in the CIO, and they fused racial and economic justice, suggesting that actually racial solidarity was key to general class solidarity and building a middle class and reducing labor exploitation. This was not lost on the enemies of civil rights at the time, right? So the CIO is sending people, activists, black, white, often white people were Jewish, from northern cities, sending them on what was called Operation Dixie to unionize the Jim Crow South, including black sharecropping workers in the South. And there was astounding historical literature at the time. So the union, the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, put out this incredible 1940s poster. Protect yourself from this menace. The Ku Klux Klan is anti-Jew, anti-Negro, anti-Catholic, anti-foreigner, and anti-labor. Organize industrially. Line up. There was an important line of thinking at the time that actually racial conflict, it produces economic exploitation of people of all racial groups. And this was actually quite prominent in the understanding of the Jim Crow South and racial violence of the time. Similarly, the United Auto Workers played a major role in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So my grandparents, who I mentioned, they had this picture. On the left is Walter Reuther, the president of the United Auto Workers at the time. He's in the front row at the March to Freedom in Detroit in 1963. There's a huge amount of correspondence. He's behind the scenes at the March on Washington, right? You can see as Martin Luther King comes out for his speech, Walter Reuther's does the go get him thing. He's the last guy to do that, right? This was prominent union history. The UAW also bailed out jailed Birmingham civil rights protesters as well. And history of labor and the civil rights movement that we don't know as much. So statistically, what I and Paul Freimer there, my co-author, did in a paper and now sort of set of papers is we looked at the actual statistical causal effect of becoming a union member. And I'll try to also, this paper is also available on the internet for free. Do not pay, never pay some academic journal to rent or buy a PDF of a paper. Just email the professor. But what we find is not only that our union members report in surveys as being more supportive of democratic institutions like voting rights and less racially resentful, less in favor of racial conflict and more racially solidaristic in surveys than our non-union members. We not only find that, right, even controlling for their demographics, but we also find causally that if we track people across time, and we can see when they became a labor union member, right? White workers actually become more supportive of democracy and democratic institutions and less racially resentful after becoming union members. And that's, again, this legacy of labor unions suggesting, you can vote on the basis of, the threatening they-them pronouns and, making sure we have the politician who talks trash on the right people on TV and things like that. Or you can vote, not vote in favor, that's exactly what the bosses want, right? And you can vote instead in favor of sort of rising economic tide for people of all racial groups. And that's still part and central to the U.S. labor movement, and they have explicit sort of trainings around that for labor organizers and leaders. So here, I love this quote from Martin Luther King in 1962 in his letter to the Amalgamated Laundry Workers. He writes, The coalition that can have the greatest impact in the struggle for human dignity here in America is that of the Negro and the forces of labor because their fortunes are so closely intertwined. And he's here, here in this photo. He is on a strike picket line, right? So again, Martin Luther King as well saw the labor movement as sort of key to democracy in the U.S. more broadly. AFSCME in New York City, AFSCME 420 has a set of pins that's like kind of famous and cool design. So overall, the labor movement, right? So labor movement increased sort of interracial solidarity and support for democracy across racial groups, can be part of sort of organizationally solidifying American democracy, and the destruction of the labor movement since the 1980s has left American democracy much more open to the culture war politics that we see so central to mass politics today, conflict around sort of racial iconography in media, around trans rights. Some of these have real substantive consequences, but many are playing on sort of non-policy-based resentments. And that opening was really left vulnerable due to the decline and destruction of the labor movement. So now, thinking about what policies to pass. So many of those labor union restrictions, and in the Q&A we can talk about this a bit, many of those labor union restrictions happened at the state level. And now, with states changing control with political parties, there may be opportunities to use policy to re-expand the labor movement. And there are so many, my students in my undergraduate classes, so many work at Starbucks and Amazon and are part of these movements, and it's inspiring. So Gen Z, like I said last time, the music, your music's not great, but very inspiring labor activism at Starbucks, Amazon, and so forth. So, some good, some bad. So here's my book once again. This book generally touches on many of the things I mentioned, the threats to democracy in the last lecture, as well as some potential solutions mentioned in this lecture, and generally is focused on how the interplay between our nationalized politics, where we're all really attuned to the tug of war over the direction of the country, with the important state and local institutions in the American Constitution. Thanks so much for your time. Super looking forward to questions and comments.
Thank you. How do we get these lights? Do we continue with the lights like this? Okay, we're going to continue with the lights like this. Oh, they're coming back on. Look at that. Magic. All right. While you are thinking of your question, there are mics here. There are mics over here. You can also send in a question to May I ask? Somebody help me out there. I appreciate you.
Very polite email
Yes,
address.
may I ask? At uw.edu. May I ask at uw.edu? Yes.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. I was intrigued that you didn't say anything about the makeup of the Senate in terms of 2 senators per state, no matter how big the state is.
Yeah.
And does that give an unfair advantage to places that have hardly any population that tend to be rural? And that gets to sort of a segue, that divide between rural and urban that has occurred with urban areas being in general more Democrat. And how does the gerrymandering affect that? So I'm just really curious about your thoughts, because those were not among your solutions, or maybe they're just too impossible.
No, what a great question to start off with. So I would say one way, for broader context, let's zoom out. And I focused a lot, because my research is on it, on American federalism, the role of state governments versus the national government and so forth. But if we zoom out, I think one silver lining of the wild years of American politics we've experienced is that people are really thinking hard about U.S. constitutional institutions and whether they are, actually effective at creating a healthy political society, or are they just legacies of sort of bygone eras or serve different purposes? So one of the main ones was the Electoral College, right? That's not a popular vote. That seems kind of obvious. Like, why not give the presidency to whoever gets the most votes? Seems like most other countries use that, right? Like, seems a little antiquated. But the other big one is the U.S. Senate, right? And the U.S. Senate features, due to what the question said, 2 senators per state. And as state populations continue to diverge, with high population states getting bigger and low population states like Wyoming staying low population, we have increased malapportionment at a greater extent than ever before, where someone's vote, if you're voting for a senator in Wyoming, your vote counts about 75 times what that, like, for the power of the Senate as a voter in a big population state, right? And as we like to say, land doesn't vote, like, not exactly sure why. It's the basis of how to ratify the Constitution, how to get small population states to sign on to the U.S. Constitution and not remain separate colonies. One way was to give them outsized power through the Senate. That was in the 1780s, and now it's producing extremely malapportioned outcomes and really increasing the influence of certain classes of voters, whiter, more rural, as opposed to high population states, which tend to be more racially diverse set of voters. And it's just, if you look at small states, a number of those states have smaller populations than Metro Seattle, many states combined, like, are less than Los Angeles County, right? 2 senators.
Great.
Power of the unions. Let's talk about the craft unions. The craft unions have not been champions of democracy. Those of you who lived in Seattle in the 1960s remember that there were 2 big political issues: the Vietnam War and the attempt by liberals in Seattle to pass an initiative to the people that would outlaw racial discrimination in housing. We were unable to get SPIA or IAM to support us. We had active opposition from the craft unions. More recently, African Americans attempted to get jobs in the craft unions in the 1970s, 1980s. They organized quite a number of subcontractors that were supposed to get favorable treatment to bring subcontractors, unionized subcontractors, to work beside the craft unions. That was subverted very significantly. The result was that new immigrants from Mexico became non-union workers in the craft labor area. And they've essentially taken over residential construction. Whereas in the 1950s and 1960s, you couldn't build a house in Seattle unless you had a labor agreement on that house. A single family residence had to be built by labor union or you were in trouble. Nowadays, you'll never see a single family house being built by anything other than non-union labor.
This is
Yeah. So I'd like to hear your comment on
absolutely.
the craft unions
So
as
great.
opposed to any other unions.
So absolutely. So one thing is long-term history. It's true. Craft unions, which tend to be more technically skilled and artisanal, at least historically, right? And those explicitly racist unions, like the Knights of Labor, were craft unions of artisanal craft workers rather than what are called industrial unions. So you can contrast that with the ILWU, Longshore Union, for example, here, very different politics and positions towards democracy. That's absolutely true. But the other pattern, in this case, of finding ways to find lower wage work, non-union work to replace unionized work is absolutely a pattern that's been part of outsourcing northern, more union jobs to southern non-union states first, then as well as outsourced internationally. This is absolutely a pattern, and it's a very tense pattern that's around the world with immigration and racial-based conflict. So Germany, a much more heavily unionized country, one issue that's happening as immigration has expanded is a sort of tension where parts of, again, unions are highly diverse sets of workers within them of all types of racial groups. This is a nuanced issue. There's not some sort of plug and play democracy fix thing, right? But here in Germany, what's been happening is a policy of what's called dualism, where the existing overwhelmingly male and longer-term, like ethnic German union members have kept their high-skilled union jobs, and then there's been less entry into unions by women as women join the workforce and later immigrants in Germany. There's a similar dynamic in the U.S. So this absolutely keeping a focus and looking at which unions have sort of threaded this needle by trying to keep racial and immigration-based solidarity of the rank and file, and really having a long-term perspective that solidarity across working people is going to benefit everybody in this case, which tends to follow, which tends to then generate more pro-democracy attitudes if you think this will be better off for everyone. So here, again, labor unions are in that sort of moment, but I will say, for the most part, the large labor unions with respect to immigration in the U.S. have gone in a huge change since the 1990s. Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers were explicitly anti-undocumented people, right? It was a very different period, whereas now the major labor unions are seeing that exploited, undocumented immigrant workers in farms and meat packing plants, especially in the U.S. South, that sort of exploitative low-wage labor is undercutting all labor, right? Again, which produces a more generally solidaristic rather than resentful, we should have authoritarianism, only I should have democratic rights, right? And I should pull up the ladder and restrict those for other groups, right? Instead, labor unions are trying, not always succeeding, at threading that needle. So keeping an eye on that is really important.
All right, so we are running low on time. I'm going to do what I call...
I talked too much.
No, you're fantastic. A quick round robin, which is I have two people at the microphones. These are going to be our last questions. There's a number of other questions that came in on here on the iPad. I will read out one at the end. Jake, you will then have about 3 to 5 max minutes to respond. I'm going to ask the two people here if you can make sure your question is a question. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you for your presentation. Can you talk a little bit about some of the recent state-level threats to labor unions, like right-to-work acts, and how that impacts labor unions? And do you think the enactment of similar acts, plus the lack of unity, will cause a growth in racial discrimination in workplaces?
Excellent.
Okay, that's one. That's fantastic. And two, fantastic.
Should I say my question?
Go for it. Yeah.
I was just curious about the constitutionality of creating a federal election agency and how that would play into the Supreme Court's recent cases on election law, specifically with the Voting Rights Act and the pre-clearance formula stuff.
Outstanding
And then
couple
there's
questions.
one more from here that I'm going to read.
Please.
Because there's more than one on here, which
All
is
right.
what states should we look out for coming up? And if we don't want this to be biting our fingers after each election, then what needs to happen?
Awesome. Thanks for great questions, everyone. So the first one, state-level laws in the 2010s were really crucial in reducing the political organizing capacity of labor. And so great paper, an economist, James Feigenbaum, Vanessa Williamson is at the Brookings Institute, and then Alex Hertel-Fernandez, who, like Professor Francis, was like one of my sort of academic heroes as I was coming up. They wrote a prominent economics paper that showed that the right-to-work laws in the 2010s in states like Wisconsin and Michigan dramatically increased Republican vote shares subsequently by reducing the sort of financial and organizational capacity of unions through a right-to-work law, for example. This reduced the get-out-the-vote capacity of labor unions, which tend to turn out, diverse working individuals who tend to vote Democratic. Those states then became more solid red. So that quick 2010 wave election in the states enabled the Republican Party to restrict labor unions, which then paid off further political dividends. That was hugely consequential. I cannot overstate the importance of that set of laws. In Ohio, Wisconsin, 2016 presidential election would have looked entirely differently absent those laws. And this segues nicely into which state to watch. So the state of Michigan, for the first time, has unified blue since the early Obama era prior to 2010. This means that the Democratic Party has a new opportunity to reverse that right-to-work law and repeal it. The Unified Democratic Party of Virginia, prior to Glenn Youngkin winning in 2021, and if you guys remember this, they did not repeal their right-to-work law. That was an opportunity to have some political dividends down the road they didn't take, but Michigan looks poised to be different, which is actually quite fascinating, something to watch. And then the courts, super crucial. The courts, like the federal judiciary is now, it's highly conservative, like the conservative legal movement since the 1970s mobilized and won hugely. Like, can't be overstated on a broken record. But the point there is that was a long-term set of political investments to nominate judges, right? The Democratic Party has not, at the national level, done all it can to ensure a liberal majority on the court. Rather, I hate to be this guy, but like, you gotta retire on the Supreme Court. There's lifetimes appointments, but I do think a couple potential. One is there could be term limits for Supreme Court justices. That is currently constitutional. That would be good to cycle this out. I don't know how to get the political capacity to do that. The other one is that it is true, this current Supreme Court majority seems poised to throw out many of the guardrails around voting rights and gerrymandering. So I think it will take creative congressional legislation. But again, for the most part, if Congress writes something very clearly, there's not a whole lot the Supreme Court can do. What the Supreme Court can do is say this contradicts other constitutional provisions or things like that. But for the most part, legal scholars, a lot of my best friends are law professors. They think actually national democracy reforms of this sort could, for example, fully ban gerrymandering at the very least. Thanks again so much for the time. Thanks to Yvette Moy and Megan Francis for introducing me.